still afternoon, 3 American planes from the Brothers to the Rescue Project took off from Miami. Their mission? To search for Cuban rafters fleeing the Castro regime. Over Cuban airspace, Castro orders his air force to attack. 2 planes are shot down, 4 Americans die. Washington erupts in outrage and extends the 34-year-old Cuban embargo. Clinton signs the Helms Burton Act, designed to punish foreign companies who do business with Cuba. Europe then accuses the White House of breaking international law. But America defies this approval, insisting Cuba is a very real American problem, with implications for democracy around the world.
You don't want to bring these kinds of things up all the time, but let's be blunt. The United States spent billions of dollars and lost tens of thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives, protecting democracy in your hemisphere. Now we're asking you for help in helping establish democracy in our hemisphere. And the reaction we've gotten from our allies has not been the one we would have expected.
It's not Cuba that's isolated, it's the United States that's isolated. The rest of the world is against Helms Burton. And that's not a good situation to be in for the United States. And it's not a good situation for us that the United States is as isolated as it is.
The Cubans are doing what they think is best for their people. And I think it's an extraordinary feat of arrogance for a country like the United States to actually decide that it knows what's best for Cuba. You may be a capitalist, you may be a socialist, but I don't think one should try to impose that extraterritorially on another country.
We have learned to deal with such laws in 37 years. So we are ready to face it, and we are facing it.
Vuelvo a nacer lejos de aquí, y aseguro que te voy a encontrar. Ya no podemos dejar la dependencia que unió dos corazones que aunque distintos.
For 3 decades, Cuba has endured extreme US hostility. It's left this small communist island impoverished. The US trade embargo has brought the citizens of a deep depression.
Tú eres la flor, la ternura que me vino a salvar. Yo soy la espina mortal.
Until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Eastern Bloc, Cuba's trade and industry was entirely propped up by the Soviet Union. When Fidel Castro slipped to power, he destroyed the US-supported Batista dictatorship. The Cuban playground of wealthy Americans was gone. Thousands fled to America, from where they would haunt Castro forever. And Russia eagerly offered Cuba's new communist regime a partnership and gave the Cubans instant wealth and power.
We have no Soviet Union to be puppet of. We have no troops in Angola or Ethiopia. There's no guerrilla warfare in Latin America. And now they have come up with democracy.
But it was Castro's nationalization of American business and property that angered the US most. Today, we nationalize all our petroleum companies.
3 millones de
A
nuestros
million of our
hermanos
brothers
carecían de
control
luz
of the
eléctrica.
land today.
Hoy ha sido nacionalizada la
And
compañía
today,
de
we also
electricidad.
nationalize the electricity company.
En Cuba había pueblos enteros
Cuba, there are
aislados.
many villages.
Hoy ha
in
sido
Cuba.
nacionalizada la
And
compañía de
today, we
teléfono.
nationalize the phone company.
Nuestro suelo
So today
era
our
nuestro
land is
solamente
our
como
tomb.
tumba.
Ever since, the US and Cuba have been at loggerheads, in 1962 to the brink of nuclear war. During Cuba's nationalization campaign, properties owned by foreign business were also taken by the new government. The US says it hasn't been paid for those properties and now wants the rest of the world to stop trading with Cuba.
The objective of the Helms Burton bill is to discourage foreign investment. But anybody who's financing the investment, anybody who is of any bank, any subsidiary, anyone who is connected with that investment will also be subject to the Helms Burton bill. So banks, I mean, it's across the board.
It is interesting to notice that this year, after the Helms Burton law was signed by the U.S. president, we had 40 joint ventures signed.
Trade with Cuba continues amid allegations that the American tactics are illegal.
If the United States violates international law, it loses the moral authority to demand other countries comply with that body of law. And I think that's the most adverse consequence of the Helms Burton Act.
But despite the uproar, the US clings to the belief that they do have a right to punish foreign companies who break American law by doing business in Cuba.
We are strongly opposed to extraterritorial application of domestic law, something which the Americans would never accept from anybody else in the world, and which we don't like because it is against the normal principle of international law.
Let's be honest about what this bill does. This bill only affects companies that are trafficking in stolen American property. What our friends in Europe are doing is defending the right of their citizens to take property that has been stolen by Castro from American citizens and use it for profit.
But in Guantanamo Bay, Cubans say it's the Americans who are guilty of stealing. This is a US naval base, but it's in Cuba. From here, American forces join the ill-fated brothers to the rescue in watching out for the fleeing Cuban rafters. Over the years, thousands have been hauled from the sea and brought into Guantanamo. Until 1995, they were offered US citizenship. Today, they're returned to Cuba. Many question whether Guantanamo Bay still serves the Americans a purpose. They have a perpetual lease on it and don't want to leave.
It's largely a training base. It's certainly not designed to be a platform for any intimidation or military action against the island of Cuba. It is still probably a useful basing structure for the United States, as Cuba still plays a prominent role in certainly advancing Russian military intelligence.
We've often acted toward Cuba in a proprietorial fashion. In the course of the debate on the Helms Burton Act, Congressman Torricelli of New Jersey said that Cuba will be absorbed into the southeastern United States in the post-Castro era. And I think many elements of the Helms Burton law are reflective of such an attitude, that somehow Cuba's ours.
For 35 years, Cuban dissidents have been welcomed in the US with fewer restrictions than any other group of immigrants. They are the strongest voice against the Castro regime, and they've built up a mini political and financial empire aimed at bringing down the Cuban government. Many believe the Helms Burton bill would not have been passed without them.
Cuba has now about 11 million people living on the island. Well, another 1.2, 1.3 million people live in exile, but they still think of themselves as Cubans. Well, what do you do with those people? Do you say, and they're only 120 miles away, most of them from the island, do you say you have no right to be involved in the affairs of your homeland?
And they spend money, a lot of it. And as I say, you know, if you combine passion, voting, and money, in a democracy, that means that you influence policy. And we influence policy towards the island.
Most exiles arrive in the US with a deep resentment. Human rights groups say 54,000 have died for political reasons under Castro. Among them, 12,500 executed by firing squad.
There's not a Cuban American that doesn't